Grand Rising, everyone. We are reading God's Love and Justice. Today is February 19th. It's on a Wednesday. Please remember to share this with someone that you know. God's ideal and remedial wills. Read Ephesians 1, 9 through 11. What is this text saying about predestination? Are some people predestined to be saved and others to be lost? The Greek term translated predestination here and elsewhere in Scripture does not itself teach that God casually determines history. Rather, the Greek simply means to decide beforehand. Of course, one can decide something beforehand unilaterally, or one can decide something beforehand in a way that takes into account the free decisions of others. Scripture teaches that God does the latter. Here and elsewhere, for example, Romans 8:29 and verse 30, the term translated predestined refers to what God plans for the future after taking into account what God foreknows about the free decision of creatures. Thus, God can providentially guide history to his desired good ends for all, even while respecting the kind of creaturely freedom that is required for a genuine love relationship. Ephesians 1 verse 11 proclaims that God works all things according to the counsel of his will. Does this mean that God determines everything to happen just as he desires? Read in isolation Ephesians 1, 9 to 11. It might seem to affirm this view. However, this interpretation would contradict the many texts we saw earlier that show that people sometimes reject the will of God. If the Bible does not contradict itself, how can these passages be understood in a way that is consistent with one another? This passage makes perfect sense if one simply recognizes the distinction between what we might call God's ideal will and God's remedial will. God's ideal will is what God actually prefers to occur and which would occur if everyone always did exactly what God desires. God's remedial will, on the other hand, is God's will that has already taken into account every other factor, including the free decisions of creatures which sometimes depart from what God prefers. Ephesians 1 verse 11 appears to be referring to God's remedial will. So powerful is God's foreknowledge of the future that even knowing all the choices, including the bad choices that people will make, he can still work all things together for good. What comfort can you draw from this truth? This is Pastor Patrick Graham from the Glenridge Seventh-day Adventist Church. Thank you for listening and subscribe to get this every day. And today, God bless you real good.